Our next unit that we're going to talk about is evolution. So we're going to kind of fast forward to the next unit here, and we're going to talk about evolution. So evolution, to evolve, means to change. So evolution just means change over time. Now we can see, like in this picture, big changes, right? They don't have to be big changes. It could be little changes, like, for example, maybe a species has a slightly longer fingertip length or a slightly darker color coat over time. It doesn't have to be very, very big changes. So we're going to talk about evolution, and we're going to talk about how exactly it happens. All right, so you don't need to write any of this down, but this is kind of background knowledge. So during the 1800s, people believed the plants and animals that were alive were the same ones that were alive thousands of years ago. So for example, we know that there used to be these woolly mammoths and dinosaurs and these saber-toothed tigers, and all the people thought that the bears and the hawks that are alive today were alive a long time ago. They didn't dig up fossils. They hadn't realized that there were other animals that didn't exist today that used to exist. Then they started digging up these fossils. So they started finding these fossils of things that used to exist, and they started wondering, well, why don't they exist now, right? Why aren't there any more woolly mammoths? Why aren't there any more dinosaurs? And some scientists tried to explore this idea. And one of the scientists named Charles Darwin looked at this idea really closely. So we're going to watch a short little clip on Charles Darwin, and then we'll continue.
What is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution? Let us not get controversial, but simply stick to the facts about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. An English naturalist, Mr. Darwin definitely gave us all a lot to think about. Darwin's theory of evolution actually contains two major ideas. The first idea posed by Mr. Darwin theorized the idea that evolution occurs. In other words, organisms change over time, and life on Earth has changed as descendants diverged from common ancestors in the past. The second idea from Mr. Darwin is that evolution occurs by natural selection. Natural selection is the process in which living things with beneficial traits produce more offspring than others. This results in changes in the traits of living things over time. In Charles Darwin's day, the early 1800s, most people believed that all species were created at the same time and remained unchanged thereafter. They also believed that the Earth was merely 6,000 years old. Darwin's ideas revolutionized biology as we know it. How did Mr. Darwin come up with these important ideas? It all started when he went on a voyage. In 1831, when Darwin was just 22 years old, he set sail on a scientific expedition on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He was the naturalist on the voyage. As a naturalist, it was his job to observe and collect specimens of plants, animals, rocks, and fossils wherever the expedition went ashore. Darwin was fascinated by this nature, and his job on the Beagle was the most important time of his life. He spent over 3 years of the 5-year trip exploring nature on distant continents and islands. While he was away, a former teacher published Darwin's accounts of his observations. By the time Darwin finally returned to England, he had become famous as a naturalist. During the long voyage, Charles Darwin made many observations that helped him form his theory of evolution. Some of what he found included tropical rainforests and other new habitats where he saw many plants and animals he had never seen before. An earthquake that lifted the ocean floor 9 feet, 2.7 meters, above sea level. He also found rocks containing fossil seashells in mountains far above sea level. These observations suggested that continents and oceans had changed dramatically over time and continue to change dramatically. Rock ledges that had clearly once been beaches that had gradually built up over time. This suggested that slow, steady process also changed the surface of the Earth. Fossils of gigantic extinct mammals, such as the ground sloth. This was hard evidence that organisms looked very different in the past, as it suggested that living things, including the Earth's surface, change over time.
All right, so Charles Darwin, here's what happened. Okay, so Darwin, he was a scientist. He lived in the 1800s and he went on an expedition. Okay, so he was a naturalist, he was a scientist, and he rode on a ship around the world to visit different parts and look at the animals and the plants and the different areas they had there. He ended up going to the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are circled here. They're off the coast. This is Peru and Ecuador, so South America. So he went to the Galapagos Islands, all right? So he had to take a ship. He was from England, and it took him a really, really long time, okay? So he got over to the islands. Once he got to the islands, he kept notebooks of all of these finches, all these birds and plants, and he recorded all the different types of life that they had there. So one of the things he found is he found all of these finches. So finches are birds, okay? He found all these finches. So let's take a look at these finches. So finches are birds, and notice they all look a little different, but they all look kind of similar. So he looked at these birds and he watched them and he noticed that these birds had different types of beaks, right? This one's shorter and fatter, this one's skinnier, right? This is orange skinny beak. And what he found when he watched them eat is that these birds, they had different beaks because they ate different foods, and their beaks were actually adapted to the types of foods that they ate. So this one with the big fat beak was eating seeds, and it needed that big beak in order to crush the seeds. This one that was eating the buds didn't need as large of a beak. And this one that was more like a woodpecker needed a skinny beak to get into the tree bark. So he looked at all of the finches, okay, and he found that they were all adapted to eating a different type of food. He came up with the idea that these finches all came from one species. So they all came from one species a long time ago. And over time, they changed into many different species. So this was a crazy idea. People didn't think that things changed over time, okay? A lot of the people were religious back in that day, and they believed that when things were created, they stayed the exact same. So he came up with this idea that things change, okay? So he came up and he wrote an entire book, okay? And he came up with this theory of evolution, and it was called evolution. So remember, evolution is change by natural selection, okay? So what is this idea of natural selection, okay? It's this idea that nature selects which organisms are going to live. Let's take a look first, and then I'll have you write it down. So on the left, it says, a population of mice has moved into a new area where the rocks are very dark. Due to natural genetic variation, some mice are black and others are tan. So we can see that some of them blend in, some of them don't. So which ones is this hawk or this bird going to be able to see better? It's going to be able to see the ones that don't blend in. Right? So which ones are going to get eaten? The tan one, right? So tan mice are more visible to these birds. So tan mice are eaten more often than black mice. So more black mice end up surviving, okay? So over time, we end up getting more black mice because the tan ones are easily seen and get eaten. So this is the idea of natural selection. Nature, right? This hawk, and the environment decided which ones were going to survive. So the idea of natural selection is that individuals that are better adapted to their environment, meaning they're able to survive better in their environment, they end up surviving and passing on their genes to future generations. So think about it. It all depends on your environment. If I'm a polar bear, okay, I'm going to survive really well in the Arctic. But if I'm a polar bear and I'm in the desert, am I going to survive very well? No. So if I'm a polar bear, I'm not best adapted to the desert. So this isn't like, oh, there's one species that's the best. It all depends on what environment they're in, right? So in one environment, the polar bear is going to be really well adapted in the Arctic. But when it gets to the desert, if it gets to the desert, it's not well adapted. It's not going to survive. So what are the requirements for natural selection? There are 4 things, okay? So in order for this change, this selection to happen, in order for us to get evolution, we have to have 4 things, okay? So the first one is variation. Individuals have to have different traits, okay? So variety, that's what the word variation comes from. Then we have inheritance. To inherit means to pass down. So the traits have to be able to be passed down to the offspring. Think about it. If I speak Spanish, okay, are all my babies going to be born knowing how to speak Spanish right away when they're babies? No, because speaking Spanish is not something that I pass down to my kids. It's not in my DNA, okay? Knowing how to speak Spanish is not my DNA. It's something I have to learn. Right? Or if I learn how to swim, okay? Are my kids going to be born knowing how to swim exactly? No, right? So they have to be traits that are in your DNA, okay? Hair color, length of your arms and legs, how tall you are, eye color. Selection, so the environment selects who's going to survive. And then over time, there's going to be changes. Okay, so over time we get changes in species. So let's take a look at the worksheet here that you guys are going to be doing. And this is identifying those 4 different components: variation, inheritance, selection, and time. So let's go ahead and read the first example here. There are 2 types of worms: worms that eat at night, so nocturnal worms, and worms that eat during the day, diurnal worms. The birds eat during the day and only eat the diurnal or the daytime worms. The nocturnal worms are in their burrows during this time. Each spring, when the worms reproduce, they have about 500 babies, but only 100 of these 500 ever become old enough to reproduce, right? Because they end up getting eaten. All right, so the population has variations. So how is our population different? How are our worms different? Well, we have 2 different types of worms, right? We've got nocturnal worms and diurnal worms. So we're going to write that right there. All right. Is that inherited? Is an animal born knowing if it's nocturnal, active in the night, or active in the day? Yes. Okay. And I'll give you a hint. For all of these, they're going to be inherited, okay? All right, which worms are going to end up surviving? So it says that the birds eat the diurnal worms. So only the nocturnal worms are going to survive. And then over time, the population will change so that there's more which type of worms? So if the nocturnal ones are surviving, there's going to be more nocturnal worms and less diurnal worms. I'll do one more with you. There are 3 types of polar bears, ones with thick coats, ones with thin coats, and ones with medium coats. It is fall, soon to be winter. Temperatures are dropping rapidly and the bears must be kept warm or they will freeze to death. Many of the bears have had around 2 cubs, but due to the extreme temperatures, many mothers only have 1 cub left. So what are my variations? How's my population different? What's different about my bears? They've got different coats. Thick, thin, and medium coats. Can they inherit these traits? Do they inherit how thick their coat is? Is it passed down? Yep. All right. Over time, which ones are going to survive? Probably the ones with the thick coats, right? Maybe the medium ones too, right? But because it's so cold, they have to be warm. Over time, the population will change so that there's more of which type? More of the thick coats and less of which one? codes. So you go ahead and do the other two and then turn it into me when you are done.